Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honor for me to be the moderator for this very exciting panel called Contemporary US-Russian Relations. Let me shortly introduce myself. My name is Piroska Bakos. I'm a TV journalist, news moderator, and editor specializing in foreign affairs, mainly EU politics. I'm very happy to introduce to you our prominent panelists. Dr. Sean Brennan, Associate Professor of History, University of Scranton. Dr. Brennan focuses on 20th century Russia, Austria, and Germany with special regard to intersection of religious and political history. Dr. Marco Overhaus, Deputy Head of Americas Research Division at Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik, German Institute for International and Security Affairs in Berlin, where he's responsible for analyzing US defense policy and European and transatlantic security and defense cooperation. Dr. Andrei Piontkovsky, he is currently a senior fellow at Institute for System Studies in Moscow and a visiting fellow at Hudson Institute. Originally a mathematician, but his attention moved to political science, author of several best-selling books on the Putin presidency. And Dr. Andrei P. Tsingakov, professor at the San Francisco State University, where he currently teaches Russian post-Soviet politics, comparative and international politics. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for accepting our invitation to contribute to this section. Sorry. Yes. Let me give you a brief rundown of the next 2 hours. Firstly, each panelist will give a presentation in maximum 15-17 minutes, and I will have to be very strict about this. The speeches will be followed by a roundtable discussion, and finally, the audience had the opportunity to raise questions, and I encourage everybody to do this because this is really a unique opportunity. So, first I give the floor to Mr. Sean Brennan. The title of his presentation is Relations between American and Russian Leaders and Their Effects on the Rivalry between Washington and Moscow since 1991. Please.
Well, thank you again for that nice introduction, and I want to thank the Antall Joseph Knowledge Center for inviting me here to your beautiful city. As George H.W. Bush and Mikhail Gorbachev planned for their summit in Moscow on June 30th, 1991, the global security situation, which had been dominated by relations between the United States and the Soviet Union for 45 years, seemed to have altered tremendously in the space of just a few years. 10 years before, in 1981, as the Soviet-Afghan War dragged into its second year, Moscow was pressuring the Polish government to suppress the Solidarity movement, and the newly elected President Ronald Reagan, probably the most anti-communist senior leader in the American government since John Foster Dulles in the 1950s, was ratcheting up the rhetoric about the evil empire. Relations between Washington and Moscow were at a nadir. Relations between Ronald Reagan and the ossified Soviet General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev, who had been in power since 1964, was non-existent, and a very tense phase of the Cold War was underway. But by the early 90s, the bitterness of the early 80s seemed a distant memory, as Reagan and his successor, George Bush, had a series of successful meetings with Mikhail Gorbachev, pursuing the goals of reduction of Cold War tensions in general, and also pursuing arms control. Bush and Gorbachev had seen the peaceful end of communism in Eastern Europe and the reunification of Germany, with the prospect of a more united Europe. Yet while the primary goal of the Moscow summit between Bush and Gorbachev was the completion of the START Treaty, there were numerous other issues on the agenda, among which was the very real possibility of the secession of some of the 13 republics which composed the Soviet Union. Perhaps the Soviet Union itself would not survive the same pressures which had brought down communist rule in Eastern Europe. And this was an outcome Bush hoped to prevent, if for no other reason than he was much more comfortable dealing with Gorbachev than Gorbachev's largest rival, the leader of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, Boris Yeltsin. So this essay raises the question, how important have personal relations among American and Russian leaders been in determining relations between the two states? I argue that while positive relationships between Russian and American leaders have at times led to mutually beneficial outcomes for both Moscow and Washington, especially in the years since the end of the Cold War. This has proven to be the opposite just as often. But at the same time, bitter, acrimonious attitudes of American and Russian leaders towards each other have usually led to a worsening of ties between the two countries, and at times a corresponding rise in global tensions. But then in this sense, this continues the same pattern we've seen since the end of the Second World War. As in so many cases, the relationship of the United States and the Russian Federation since 1991 features just as much diplomatic continuity with the Cold War as any significant changes. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was convinced that the strong rapport he believed he had established with Joseph Stalin at the Tehran and Yalta conferences in 1943 and 1945 would lead to a cooperative relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union that would persevere after the end of the Second World War, when in Roosevelt's mind, the United States, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and China would function as the four policemen of the post-war world. Roosevelt was even comfortable enough with Stalin to inform him of the nickname that he and many other Americans had given Stalin, Uncle Joe, which Stalin reacted to with bemused interest. Nevertheless, Stalin never trusted Roosevelt, despite grudgingly recognizing his value as an ally against Germany. This, of course, is symbolized by Stalin's statement that one must be very careful of Churchill. He is a man, if you're not looking, will steal a kopeck out of your pocket. But Roosevelt will only reach in his hand deeper for the more valuable coins. Roosevelt's successor, Harry Truman, made little secret of his dislike of many senior Soviet officials, including Stalin and his foreign minister, Vyacheslav Molotov, to both his staff and to his family, telling his daughter in a letter in 1946 he had never met people as horribly pig-headed as the Russians, adding that dealings with the Soviets were among the most taxing obligations of his entire presidency. Relations between Eisenhower and Khrushchev were similarly strained, Eisenhower disliking Khrushchev's unpredictable nature. But in this sense, that was a little different from views of Khrushchev held by other Western leaders. Of course, there was Richard Nixon, not Eisenhower, who proved to be the Western leader who really got under Khrushchev's skin during the kitchen debate of 1959. Khrushchev badly hoped that Nixon would lose the U.S. presidential election to Kennedy in 1960, but upon meeting the youthful U.S. president at the Vienna summit in 1961, was very unimpressed by Kennedy, believing him to be a weak man, hopelessly in over his head, although he was very charmed by Jackie O, of course. It was this attitude that helped produce Khrushchev's strategy of brinksmanship, which began at the crisis over Berlin and culminated in the 2-week-long Cuban Missile Crisis in October of 1962. Yet it was during this most tense of the Cold War standoffs that Khrushchev and Kennedy, often working through intermediaries, were able to cooperate and bring the crisis to an end without leading to an all-out war. Of course, any chance of this cooperation continuing into other issues was the race of Kennedy's assassination in '63 and the overthrow of Khrushchev by Brezhnev the next year. During the subsequent era of détente, Lyndon Johnson and especially Richard Nixon remained on cordial terms with Brezhnev, although it's hard to say whether they were exactly friendly. In comparison, Gerald Ford made a much more positive impression on Brezhnev during their face-to-face meetings at Vladivostok and Helsinki in 1974 and 1975, as the two frequently would engage in extensive conversation about sports in their respective countries before engaging in diplomatic negotiations. In fact, they met at Vladivostok in '74 because Ford had seen a documentary about rare tigers in the Soviet Union. He asked Brezhnev if they could have it there. Ford's successor, Jimmy Carter, also tried hard to develop a strong relationship with Brezhnev during the first 3 years of his presidency. And although Jimmy Carter received the honor of being the first Western leader to receive the Socialist Brotherhood kiss from a rather inebriated Brezhnev in 1978, relations between the two leaders, as well as between the two countries, collapsed into angry denunciations following the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in '79. Throughout the next 6 years, any type of personal connection between either Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan or the Soviet leaders Brezhnev and his successors Yuri Andropov and Konstantin Chernenko was practically non-existent. If for no other reason, of course, that the Soviet leaders kept dying at a rapid rate. Ironically, it was George Bush, the vice president at the time, who had a chance to see them in a way by attending their funerals, leading to Bush quipping that his relationship with Soviet leaders could be described as, "You die, I fly." Now, emerging from this tension, however, was one of the closest relations that ever existed between an American Soviet leader, that of Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev. Despite the bumpy start during the Reykjavik summit in 1986, Reagan and Gorbachev eventually developed a productive, even friendly relationship. And this was continued by Bush and Gorbachev, and symbolized by Soviet support for previously unthinkable policies, like the acceptance of a unified Germany as a part of NATO in 1990, and the Soviets voting for UN Resolution 678, which authorized force against the Soviet Union's former client state of Iraq in 1991. And this was an important factor in Bush attempting to shore up Gorbachev's diminishing position in the Soviet Union. Nevertheless, the very poor impression Yeltsin had made on Bush during their first meeting at the Moscow summit, as Yeltsin made numerous attempts to upstage Gorbachev, not only to Bush but also to Bush's wife, meant the US president was not eager in any fashion to deal with him. Indeed, it would not be until the Soviet Union was truly doomed in the months following the disastrous August coup by Communist Party hardliners in August 1991 that Bush finally came around to establishing a personal connection with Yeltsin. This was symbolized by the phone call between Bush and Yeltsin on December 23rd. After exchanging Christmas pleasantries, the President of the United States and the soon-to-be President of the Russian Federation discussed the future of the successor states. Yeltsin promised Bush the Russian Federation would be the only successor republic to be a nuclear power, and that Bush's old ally Gorbachev would be treated generously in retirement. Bush, for his part, guaranteed to Yeltsin the United States would support the Russian Federation's claim to replace the Soviet Union on the UN Security Council. For Yeltsin, this call to Bush completed the process which he had begun at the beginning of the month with the Belavesia Accords to move Gorbachev out of the picture and secure the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Bush and Yeltsin would meet a number of other times in 1992, but whether their relationship could have developed into a genuine partnership remains an open question, as Bill Clinton defeated Bush in the '92 elections and would serve as president for the next 8 years. The ties between Clinton and Yeltsin during the '90s were by turns productive, tumultuous, and intensely frustrating, much like relations between the two countries. Undoubtedly, no American leader had ever personalized his relationship between himself and a Russian leader to such an extent as Bill Clinton did with Boris Yeltsin. Perhaps the only comparison would be that between what Roosevelt tried to do with Stalin. For Clinton, the success of Russia as a capitalist democracy and a stable partner in the post-Cold War order was intimately tied to the political success of Yeltsin himself. Indeed, with the possible exception of Tony Blair, no foreign leader commanded as much of Clinton's attention or was seen by him as a partner in world affairs as Yeltsin did during Clinton's 2 terms in office. Clinton's determination to see Yeltsin, and by extension Russia, abandon the legacy of 7 decades of political and economic misrule by the Soviets took the form of a number of policy initiatives following the first meeting between the two leaders in Vancouver, Canada in April of 1993. Okay. In the 3 months following the Vancouver summit, a $1.8 billion aid package for Russia and a number of other former Soviet republics was followed by the Kremlin Accords in January of 1994, which ended the practice of the United States and Russia directly aiming their nuclear missiles at each other. Also notable was Clinton's forceful support during the 1996 re-election campaign for Yeltsin against the Communist Party leader Gennady Zyuganov, not only providing a lot of back-channel political advice, but also in helping secure for Russia a $40 billion loan from the International Monetary Fund, and also the next year supporting Russia's entry into the G8. Nevertheless, despite the friendly and even jovial relationship between the two leaders, quarrels once again emerged between America and Russia, much of which was related to the collapse of Yugoslavia in the 1990s. Yeltsin was in a difficult position, as he was on one hand trying to revive the special relationship between Moscow and Belgrade, which had characterized early 20th century Russian diplomacy. But on the other hand, he wished to avoid endangering Russia's new standing in the West in general, and the United States in particular. So this explains all the zigzags of Russians' handling over the Yugoslavian wars, going back and forth in terms of supporting UN resolutions to introduce peacekeepers to the region, yet also flat out rejecting Clinton's efforts to gain UN support for NATO-led airstrikes on Serbian military units. Clinton's decision to go ahead with the airstrikes regardless of Yeltsin's opposition was sharply criticized by the Russian leader. But this earlier conflict was but a preview of things to come during the Kosovo wars of the late 90s. This war, when combined with other factors, brought Russian and American relations to a new nadir not seen since the early 80s. Yeltsin repeatedly denounced the NATO air campaign against Serbia in support of Kosovo's independence, and threatened that their continuation could lead to a broader war of Russia siding with Serbia. Indeed, at the last major summit between Clinton and Yeltsin in Istanbul in November 1999, both Clinton and Yeltsin traded angry accusations with each other. Yeltsin over the NATO bombing campaign in Kosovo, Clinton over what he termed the callous indifference of the Russian military to civilian casualties in the renewed war in Chechnya, prompting Yeltsin to walk out of the conference and announce at a press conference the next day that Clinton had forgotten about the Russian Federation's considerable arsenal of nuclear weapons, all of which could be easily targeted at the United States. Now, much as George H.W. Bush had little time in the end to establish a relationship with Yeltsin, Clinton had little time to establish a connection with Yeltsin's successor, Vladimir Putin, before his own exit from office. Although apparently Clinton told Bush that Putin was the coldest of any world leader that Clinton had ever encountered. In many ways, the relationship between Bush and Putin resembled that of Clinton and Yeltsin. A cordial and even friendly rapport between two men led to some positive developments early on, but would eventually give way in later years to a more distant relationship. At once American and Russian interests inevitably conflicted. Whereas Bush, following his first meeting with Vladimir Putin in June 2001 at the Slovenia summit, said he had looked into the eyes of Putin and gained an understanding of his soul, which led his competitor for the 2000 Republican nomination, John McCain, to quip that he had seen Putin's eyes as well and had only seen the letters K, G, and B in them. Putin apparently impressed Bush, a born-again Christian, with the story of his own religious revival following a dangerous house fire in the 1980s. The two leaders remained on very friendly terms over the next 8 years. In fact, Putin was the first foreign leader to contact Bush after the Al-Qaeda attacks on September 11, 2001, and would provide logistical support for the NATO-led war in Afghanistan. But Russian opposition to the US and UK-led war in Iraq, the further expansion of NATO, and Western support for the full independence of Kosovo from Serbia again served to damage US-Russian ties after a promising early start. Efforts by Putin to find a middle ground with Bush on his planned European missile shield were rebuffed in 2007, and the Russian invasion of Georgia in 2008 further strained American and Russian ties. Thank you. Now, another change of leadership occurred in 2008, 2009, as Barack Obama became the new United States president, while Vladimir Putin transferred to the role as prime minister to allow Dmitry Medvedev to serve as Russia's president. Medvedev soon established cordial ties with the American president, who was very eager for a reset of relations with Russia, as was the Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. This led to work on a New START treaty, and of course Russia, which had opposed American efforts against Saddam Hussein in Iraq, did not choose to block at the UN efforts to remove Muammar Gaddafi's government in Libya. But the positive personal relationship between an American-Russian leader did not prevent relations from deteriorating. Putin's return to the Russian presidency in 2012 marked the beginning of a genuine downturn in ties with the United States. Although this would be an oversimplification to say that the obvious contempt with which Putin and Obama regard each other is the sole factor, it certainly contributed to it. But certainly the animosity between the two leaders, barely speaking with each other at G8 summits, barely even shaking hands, certainly resembles the Cold War environment of the early 1980s, if not the 1950s. Conflicts over Russian support for Iran's nuclear ambitions, its support for Bashar al-Assad's regime in Syria, and of course the Ukrainian political crisis over the last year has, again, led to a deep freeze in many ways in Russian-American relations. Thus, while it is a fair conclusion to say that poor personal relations between American and Russian leaders will almost certainly lead to increased tension between the two governments, a friendship between the two is no guarantee either that relations will improve, as ties between Clinton and Yeltsin, Bush and Putin certainly demonstrate. The geopolitical interests of the United States and Russia, not to mention their consistently divergent view of how global diplomacy should be conducted and what the world should be like, means that conflict, as opposed to cooperation, is more likely to be the norm, regardless of the cordiality and friendship, or lack thereof, between the leaders in Washington, D.C. and Moscow. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Brennan. Now I ask Mr. Overhaus to deliver his speech entitled Cold War Revisited, the Ukraine Crisis and the United States' Future Role in European Security and Defense. Please.
Yes, thank you very much. And all the previous panelists, of course, I also would like to thank you, the Antall József Knowledge Center, for inviting me and for organizing this great conference. I think that my presentation fits very nicely with Sean's, in the sense that Sean emphasized, stressed the importance of personal relationships. And I will do something different. I will focus a little bit more on structural aspects that tend to de-emphasize personalities. And of course, it's a very important question, and unresolved questions, to what extent personalities drive history, and maybe we can have a nice discussion about that as well. So the topic, the United States' future role in European security and defense, I would like to proceed roughly as follows. I would like to start by discussing a few questions about historical analogies. I guess that is the general topic of this conference, comparing the Cold War period with the situation we're facing today. So I just want to say a few words about that. Secondly, I would like to say a few things about the current trends, as I see them at least, in United States security and defense policy. And then finally, I would like to wrap up these two first points and say what this could mean for the transatlantic relationship. So to start with the first point on historical analogies, to use this famous quote by Mark Twain, that history doesn't repeat itself, but sometimes it does rhyme, I'd like to stress three aspects, 3 points where I think that history does not repeat itself. I guess that seems to be a little bit also the mainstream thinking here in the conference, that we're not about to revisit the Cold War. There are similarities, but there are differences. And I'd like to stress 3 differences. First difference from a US perspective, because that's my area of expertise also. I think a big difference in comparison to the Cold War period is that the United States this time does not really consider confrontation with Russia as a global confrontation. It really considers what's going on in Europe as a regional conflict. If you look at the Cold War, and I hope it's not going to be a myth, one of the myths that Mr. Kramer stressed yesterday, but I would say that during the Cold War, really the United States subordinated virtually all of its foreign and security policy interests to the rivalry with the Soviet Union. We've been discussing, of course, the obvious cases: North Korea, the Afghanistan intervention of the Soviet Union at the end of the 70s, but also I would say that most of the interventions of the United States in the Third World during the Cold War period were motivated, or at least seen through the prism of confrontation with Russia. And clearly today the situation is different, and I would even argue that it's just the contrary, that the US tries to insulate what's going on in Ukraine from the rest of its global interests, from the rest of its global foreign policy agenda. We could discuss a lot of examples. We could discuss about the Iranian nuclear program. We could talk about the fight against the Islamic State in Syria, Iraq, post-ISAF Afghanistan, and of course arms control. Arms control is a good example. As you probably know, this year the Obama administration stressed that from its perspective the Russians had violated the INF Treaty, so the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty of 1987, and there were quite strong pressures in Congress from Republicans to retaliate, so also to cancel or suspend the INF Treaty, or to slow down or even stop implementation of the New START Treaty. And I think the Obama administration had resisted these calls because it sees nuclear disarmament as an important aspect of its legacy. And so this is an example where really the effort was to insulate the regional conflict from the more global, US foreign policy agenda. So this is the first crucial difference to the Cold War, I would say, from the US perspective. From the European perspective, I think it is important to state that the confrontation with Russia today does not have the same unifying effect on the European Union countries, on NATO countries, as did the confrontation with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. I would even argue that the Ukraine crisis in some important ways is driving a wedge into the EU and NATO. And this is another important difference as compared to the Cold War. If you, for instance, look at the question of deploying US/NATO troops to Central Eastern Europe, to Poland and the Baltics in particular, there have been quite obvious divergences. The Poles and the Baltics were very much in favor. Czech Republic and Hungary were much more lukewarm about this, but there are also important differences, for instance, between Germany and Poland when it comes to the relationship to the United States. Poland obviously sees the perceived threat by Russia as crucial, as very important, something that is not true for Germany. For Germany, the relationship with the United States is still very much defined by the spy affair, by the NSA quarrel, and by other disagreements with Washington. And so there is divergence between the Polish and the German governments as well. And you can see this also reflected in polls. For instance, the Transatlantic Trends of 2014, which has already been mentioned yesterday, also shows this. So from a European perspective, big difference, Cold War and today, is that it does not have, the confrontation with Russia does not have the same unifying effect as it did during the Cold War. And third and finally, the point I would like to stress is more from a security and analytical perspective, because we also have a hard time today in assessing the crisis in Ukraine. The question is what kind of security term are we using? What's our conception of security? I would say in a nutshell, there are two different conceptions of security. The one is the more traditional one, which very much focuses on territoriality, protection and control of territory, and protection of borders. And then there's another conception of security that is a bit more indirect. It's about control of resources, control of populations, control of information. And obviously both conceptions of security were also predominant during the Cold War period, but I would still argue that the more traditional concept about territory was predominant during the Cold War. And the fact that the Berlin Wall that separated two territories was the largest symbol of the Cold War also is testimony to this, is an indication of this. If we look at the situation today with the Ukraine crisis, you could argue that NATO's response to Russian revisionism in Ukraine has been relatively traditional. If we look at the decisions at the Wales Summit, the decision to deploy rapid reaction forces, and the decision to deploy forces to Poland and the Baltic states, and so forth, I would argue that NATO's reaction has been relatively traditional and focused on territorial defense. Also, this traditional approach has been visible with regard to Russian actions in Crimea. So the annexation of Crimea has been relatively traditional in security terms as well. But then if you look into eastern Ukraine, security is more about how to control populations, how to control information, and how to control resources. So this is a different conception of security. And of course, this has implications for NATO's security policy as well, because if you apply traditional approaches to non-traditional threats, you will probably end up with a recipe for disaster. So we need to think about what's our conception of security. And I think there are also quite important differences between the Cold War period and the situation that we're facing today. So this brings me basically to the second point of my presentation. What are the major trends of US security and defense policy? I guess my major... Sorry? 5 minutes. I guess my major hypothesis is that we should not expect a rebalance of the United States back to Europe. You're probably all aware that we have this debate in the United States about the rebalance to Asia, the pivot to Asia. Over the past 25 years, the United States has strongly emphasized its military footprint, its military presence in Europe, and decreased this presence significantly. And I would argue that even the Ukraine crisis will not lead to a longer-term revision or reversion of this trend. At first sight, there are signs that the US is really re-engaging in European security. There was the visit of Obama in Poland in June 2014, the visit of Obama in Estonia in September 2014, where he stressed security guarantees and stressed or made statements of reassurance to the countries. In Poland, he announced the so-called European Reassurance Initiative, which has a volume of roughly $1 billion over 2 years, and this money is supposed to be spent on deploying, rotating US forces into Europe and giving more money to joint exercises and so forth. But as I said, despite these signs, I argue that there will be no rebalance of the US back to Europe after America has reduced its military footprint over the past 25 years. And I just would like to give one reason why I think this is the case. I think if you look at the United States and you see this, you see a combination of declining resources, specifically in the defense area, and shifting geographic priorities. If you look at the trajectories of the US defense budget, specifically as a proportion of gross domestic product, you will see that this proportion has declined significantly. So there are less resources available. And also the strategic documents of the US defense policy of 2012 and 2014 show that the US has a lower level of ambition these days than it used to have previously. And at the same time, you have pressing security challenges in the Near East, Middle East, Asia. The Iraq case in the Middle East is obvious. And also it's interesting to look at the polls in the United States. So recent polls show that Ukraine crisis is not seen as a severe security threat comparable to Islamic terrorism or Iran's nuclear program or North Korea's nuclear program. So the focus, the domestic focus of attention in the US is elsewhere. It's not on Ukraine. And finally, on the European Reassurance Initiative that I've already mentioned, I would still say that the $1 billion of this reassurance initiative isn't really a big deal of money. It's roughly 0.2% of the US defense budget. And also Obama has really stressed that the current efforts in Eastern Europe will not come at the expense of other defense priorities, such as the commitment to the Asia-Pacific rebalance. So this brings me to the conclusion. My final point, what does all this mean for the transatlantic security and defense relationship? I guess the most crucial conclusion from a European perspective is that dealing with the Ukraine crisis politically, militarily, intelligence, and so forth will mostly be a European task, a European responsibility. And this is in fact also a big difference to the Cold War period. Because the US is seeing the Ukraine crisis as a regional matter, Europe, or specifically the European Union and European NATO countries, have not only more responsibility but also more leeway, more flexibility to act. And I think that when we look at economics, for instance with regard to sanctions, the European EU and NATO members have shown quite some unity and some common effort, but this is definitely not the case, I would say, in security and military affairs. There were reports earlier this year that NATO lacked readiness, and also the state of the German armed forces isn't very positive. There have been debate about lack of readiness of the German armed forces. But this is really the final point of my presentation. It's definitely that we need more creative thinking from the side of the Europeans. So it's not just about spending more money on defense. And this brings me back to this point I made earlier about the proper security paradigm, the proper conception of security. Our measures these days have to go far beyond territorial defense and need to address more untraditional, less traditional security threats, which are more about political blackmailing and control over people and resources. So we need to have a more comprehensive take on security, looking beyond military responses, looking at the role of intelligence, information, media campaigns, and also finally looking at the politics of minorities, because the politicization of minorities has been a crucial aspect of the whole challenge that we're facing in 2014. Obviously, dealing with minorities is mostly seen, for instance, in the Baltic countries as a national sovereign aspect, but the Ukraine crisis has shown us that this has an international security dimension as well, and it should be considered as part of our comprehensive take on this crisis. I will leave it there. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Mr. Pontiovsky said to me on Wednesday, after the ceremony of the Visegrad Bridge Award handed over to Mr. Lech Walesa, that in his speech he will be as radical as he can. Let's see what it means. The title of his presentation is The End of the Post-Cold War Period, Putin's Crimean Speech as the Manifesto of a Revisionist Power. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Piroshka. Well, the fact is that relations between Russia and the West, between Russia and the United States especially, are worsening with every passing day. I remember well the Soviet time, and I should tell you that I don't remember the state TV anti-Western, anti-American campaign of such intensity and such hostility as a current one. The question whether we are already at the beginning of new Cold War is an academic one. I quote now the statement of much more authoritative and influential persons than me. I mean the Secretary of Security Council of Russian Federation, Mr. Patrushev. In the matter of foreign and security policy, he is number 2 in Putin's hierarchy after Putin himself. He gave an interview to one of the government papers, Izvestia, on October 15th, under the title Холодная война, Cold War. But he was much more radical than just to say that, well, the Cold War is beginning. His point was the Cold War has never been interrupted, that we are in state of 70 years Cold War between Soviet Union and Russia and United States since 1945. This is the opinion of person number 2 in Russian Federation. How to explain this phenomenon? Well, it's not easy. Every scholar, Western scholar of Russia, knows the famous Winston Churchill saying that Russia is a riddle wrapped in a mystery and embedded inside an enigma. Yes, Russia is a very mysterious object, and it deserves for its understanding and explanation several different angles of view. Until now, during 2 days of our conference, all panelists try to address this issue from geopolitical point of view. Well, I agree that it's important, and many yesterday such view was very eloquently presented by my distinguished colleague, Professor Vladimir Pechatnikov, who put forward the set of Russian concerns, grievances, complaints shared by majority of Russian political elite. But I think that this angle is not sufficient. I think that the rupture between Russia and the West much deeper than just geopolitical rivalry. They are still very different metaphysically and ideologically. And to clarify it, I should return to the subject of our yesterday's panel. What happened during the end of the Cold War in Central Europe and in Soviet Union? There is common wisdom that the Cold War ended because people of Soviet Union and Central Europe overthrown communist system. Well, the process were very different in Central Europe and in Soviet Union. Central Europe your countries passed through twofold revolution: democratic revolution against communist system and national liberation revolution against domination of superpower. Well, what was going in Soviet Union? The day before yesterday, Nobel Prize winner Lech Walesa said us that it was failed attempt to reform the communism. I humbly disagree with a great Paul. Communism was all but dead in 1985 in the minds and hearts of members of Politburo. They didn't believe anymore in this system. They were smart people and they realized that communist ideology can't produce their success in economics, economy and technology. And perestroika was not failed attempt to reform communism. Perestroika was successful attempt to reform nomenclature rule. Their project was to preserve their power, their influence, but throwing out the communist ideology. This was an enormous project on converting their absolute collective political power into huge economic power of individuals of this nomenclature. The first billionaires appeared not in Russian Federation but in Soviet Union, and they were members on Central Committee of Communist Party, former guest minister Mr. Chernomyrdin, who organized his concern Gazprom in 1989, and former deputy oil minister Mr. Oleg Perov, who organized his oil company. And nomenclature privatization under Yeltsin only developed this tradition. What was created in Soviet Union have all the appearances of market economy, similar to the Western, but it was very, very, very different stuff. In Russia, there is no key element of market economy, private property. Oh yes, formally it exists, but private property of every owner is conditional. The property of owner of oil company is conditional of his relationship with president of the country and his administrative resource. The property of shop owner in the street depends on his relationship with local police chief and so on. This system is, in economic sense, is as sclerotic as old communist system, and it can't create modernization, can't create innovation, can't create stable economic growth. It can prosper under exorbitant oil prices because basically Russia is economically in an oil country. I don't want to demonize Putin. It's not he who created this system. He inherited this system and developed it. He was appointed by Yeltsin family and oligarch who lost election to protect this system. And he fulfilled his obligation. The only thing he's changed, he brought to power, to economic and political power, his former bodies from KGB and from St. Petersburg City Council as first Russian oligarchs of Yeltsin generation was the person close to his family. And the political system in Russia is corresponding to this system of economic kleptocracy. It's an authoritarian system, and its task is to preserve it for life. Putin is a president for 15 years also, and everybody understands that he determined to stay in president for life, as in African countries or Central Asian countries. So this is a very specific economic and political system, have very much common with Europe and United States models. Personally, these rulers of Russia integrated himself very deeply in the Western system. They save, shop, rest, socialize in the West, keep the essence in the Western banks, had a lot of real estate and so on. But they are very strongly against Russia as a country integration in the system of political and economic competitiveness. And just a case study for functioning of the system, Ukrainian crisis. Ukrainian crisis began not in February this year, but in the summer of last year, when Putin, by any means, by blockading Ukrainian trade, by bullying, blackmailing Yanukovych, and then bribing him, tried to prevent the association of Ukraine with the European Union. He sincerely perceived this association agreement is a threat, but not a threat to Russian security or threat to Russian economy. That was a threat to his personal power and the power of this clan he has. Because this agreement, association agreement, was first of all about changing the rule of game inside Ukraine. The Ukrainian Rada should have passed 100 of pieces of legislation turning this country into model from standard post-Soviet kleptocracy similar to Russian to the model of political and economic competitiveness. And in Putin's perception and perception of Russian ruling elite, this would create a very negative example for Russian society. Because really, we Russians and Ukraine are very close by mentality, by characters, and this was dangerous for. And he succeeded. Finally, he succeeded. Yanukovych refused to sign agreement. But what was unexpected, and they were not talking about Crimea. In December, when everything was okay, Ukraine is not signing agreement, nobody talked in Moscow about problems of Russian population in Crimea. Everything changed. Everything changed in February 20th, when anti-criminal revolution won in Ukraine and overthrew the regime of Yanukovych. And this potential threat to Putin presidency and to Russian regime became immediate threat. And so this revolution should be crushed in Putin perception, and Ukraine rather submitted to its rule or dismantled. And the annexation of Crimea was the step number one. I think 2-3 additional. Because I want to talk about a very important point, about Putin's speech, Crimean speech on March 18. Almost every panelist during these 2 days noted that there's an enormous difference between Soviet Union and modern Russia because there is no quasi-religious ideology in Russia. Putin understood this point, and in his speech in March 18, he set this new ideology of so-called Ruski Mir, Russian world. He introduced, for the first time, he introduced the concept disunited nation. He said, we are disunited nation. We should gather historical Russian lands. That's why we took Crimea. And he claimed his right, not only right, but his sacred duty to protect not Russian citizens, but ethnic Russians all over the world. And in the latest Duma piece of legislation, they go even further. They proclaim their rights and duty to protect all dissident and former citizens of Soviet Union and even former Russian Empire. This idea of Russian vote created a kind of ideology, of big style of ideology, which every authoritarian or dictatorial regime needs. And certainly this claim not only isolates Russia from the West, but it's created enormous problem even with our closest allies on post-Soviet space. It scared a lot both Lukashenko and Nazarbayev. Read the latest interview of Lukashenko. He just bombasted this concept of this pretensions of Russian elite on domination. Nazarbayev said that maybe he will go out from custom unions. This new ideology of Ruski Mir create a full picture of revisionist power, which isolate itself of the outer world and create enormous problem for Russian people, first of all, and for Russian state. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And last but not least, I give the floor to Mr. Tsigankov with the topic, the great power rival in Europe and Eurasia.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for inviting me to this excellent conference. I too prepared some slides to assist you in following this presentation. I enjoyed the discussions on whether or not this is a new Cold War, and I think we will most likely revisit this during this session. Let me shift from the question of responsibility and the question of who did what to whom in US-Russia relationships to a different question, to consequences of these disagreements for the international order. That is something that we haven't yet explicitly discussed, and yet we are in a very different territory today. This is a different world system. This is a different international order that we need to discuss. We are now in the fundamental change since not just the end of the Cold War, but also since the end of what we called unipolar moment. So let me submit 2 points to you. One is that this fundamental change is in place, and the other one is, or has more to do with the content of this new world order. And that content, now that we are in transition, I will call it post-hegemonic transition, that content can be described as a rivalry, great power rivalry. For the time being, we are going to live with this system and try to manage all the problems that it has. Multiple regions are affected by this great power rivalry. Europe, Eurasia, Middle East. I will focus only on 2 briefly for the purpose of our discussion. Let me discuss Europe and even more briefly Eurasia, because of course Eurasia affects us all here, all of those who live in Europe as well. So the first point to make here is to emphasize the key developments in the new world system. We have to live with decline, irreversible decline of the Western material power and Western soft power, credibility, if you will. Increasingly, the United States in the world is perceived as destabilizing power, as almost a world troublemaker. Certainly outside the West, this is the perception. And as a result of these two phenomena, as a result of the United States decline, military decline, and soft power decline, it has growing difficulties to project power globally. And all these examples, from Afghanistan to Iraq and Syria, and increasingly Asia and South China Sea, and Eurasia as well, show lack of the United States' ability to project power. On the other hand, we have a rise of non-Western world. And it's not just Russia's use of force in the year 2008 and more recently in Ukraine. It is also other developments. It's the emergence of a powerful coalition called BRICS coalition. And the Fortaleza summit was especially important because it laid out foundations for alternative economic and financial structure. It's not there yet, but the foundations are emerging. And then it's also regionalization of the world, with Shanghai Cooperation Organization and Collective Security Treaty Organization increasingly controlling Eurasia, and other regions developing their own institutions. The second point to make here is that this is still the world of uncertainty. We do not have balancing coalition so far to the United States. Rather, this is what one scholar in the United States referred to as unbalanced multipolarity. And we have, as a result of this intense competition, intense promotion of different values and interests, we have breakdown of the old order, but we also have lack of other incentive to cooperate. There is no trust, that's one incentive to not cooperate, and the other one is the absence of one unifying threat. The ISIS problem is not there yet to galvanize sufficient cooperation on part of Russia and the United States. And that's what intensifies the security dilemma on a global scale. Mistrust feeds mistrust, and that creates the situation that I described as great power rivalry, which is, if you'd like a definition, simply intense competition over values and interests. This is a post-hegemonic world because we have decline of the old hegemon, and we have decline of the old hegemon associated rules on the one hand, but on the other hand, we do not have new rules in place yet. We do not have new balance of power yet, and this is a transition from the unipolar system to the new one. So if you like, we have gone from the end of the Cold War, from the end of the bipolar system with an ideological intensity, global scope of competition over values and interests, and bipolar competition. We went to a unipolar system with dominance of one power and interests of one power promoted on a global scale. Russia, in this case, strategically retreated. Others did not issue any serious challenge to the system. And today, roughly since the year 2008, when Russia-Georgia conflict took place, we have moved in a different direction. We have moved in the direction of post-hegemonic world. It's not a new Cold War, because there is no ideological intensity, ideological competition. There are different values, but they are not really in confrontation with one another. It's also regional and asymmetrical rather than global, and that's another distinction. And then we also have multiple actors rather than two poles, as in case of the Cold War. Now, let me move forward and apply this framework to the Ukraine crisis. In Europe. Here what we have essentially is a competition of two groups of actors. It's United States and Europe coalition against Russia. There are certainly differences between the United States and Europe. I take Marcus' point here. We'll be able to discuss it further. But on a larger scale, there are also compatible, these two powers against Russia. United States' general interest is still to be able to preserve hegemony to the extent possible, particularly in Europe, through NATO, through free trade agreements, through exclusion of Russia. The European Union is interested to expand further without straining ties with Russia and the United States, and that's done primarily through European Union. And Russia would like to continue to build relationships, economic relationships, and maintain cultural ties with Europe. And it does want to undermine, slowly dismantle United States hegemony in Europe. So what happened in Ukraine was the combination of these actors' preferences and interests. United States' triple goal here is to control the EU, expand control and influence to Ukraine, and check Russia. And do so mostly through the European Union and making multiple promises to Kiev. The European Union goal is slowly expand the European Union by cutting Ukraine from the Eurasian Union, not yet incorporating Ukraine into the European Union. That may take decades rather than years. And that explains only the offer of associated membership agreement. And Russia, of course, wants to influence Ukraine to the extent possible through energy subsidies, through relationships with Kiev's elites, through bringing Ukraine to the Eurasian Union. For obvious reasons, Ukraine is much too important for Russia, for trading with Europe, for cultural relationships, and for strategic purposes as well. So overall, what you have is a bipolar situation in this region. On the one hand, US-EU values and interests, and Russia's values are different from those of the West. They incorporate the notion of strong state system rather than competitive system. And interests of Russia are also different. It's important to have a compromise. And the structure of this compromise is relatively clear. It's important for Ukraine to have a chance to trade both with the European Union and with the Eurasian Union. It's important to establish military neutrality of this country. It's important to respect minorities and to have some autonomy for the East and South. But at this point, neither Russia nor the West are in the mood for compromise. And if that continues, future consequences will be dire, and they will most likely include at least these 4 points that are in front of you. Ukraine will disintegrate, not just de facto, but legally as well. Crimea, therefore, is just the beginning. So far, we have one large Transnistria in Donetsk and Lugansk, and that's just the beginning again. Secondly, US hegemony will only be preserved in the center and the west of Ukraine, but not in the east and south. There will be weakening of economic and of ties between Russia and the European Union, and there will be further chance for Russia acting more provocatively in Eurasia, specifically with respect to those states that are eager to break away from Eurasia and join the European Union. That is read oftentimes by Russian hawks as a future invitation to NATO. Let me say a few words about Eurasia, since I'm limited by time.
3 minutes left.
How much time do I have? 2 minutes. Okay. Here we have also bipolar relationships, a coalition between Russia and China on the one hand and the West on the other. And you also have different interests, again, the emphasis on strong state values and very different energy interests in Eurasia. Russia and China are also in competition over several aspects of their relationships, but they're also compatible because neither one wants full hegemony in the region. Russia wants to have political and military hegemony, whereas China wants economic hegemony. And the West, in this case, will lose the ability increasingly to control the region. The issue is not just to check the power of Russia and China, but to be able to have some say in Eurasia. And that will be further lost as a result of great power rivalry. We will have, in the future, decline of the West's ability to check power of Russia and China. We will have further rise of China, most likely, and its influence in Eurasia. We are likely to have also stagnation or even decline of the Eurasian Union as an independent entity, and Russia's further militarization in response to China's rise and the West pressures. Since I'm almost done with my time, let me conclude by emphasizing again that this is a highly dangerous time relative to the Cold War, perhaps more dangerous than the Cold War, due to this unstable hegemonic transition that may last for 2 decades or so. And there is a risk of great power war as well. So 3 scenarios to conclude. One is order and balanced polarity, and that is not yet in cards. We don't see signs of that taking place yet. The other one is war and hardening of alliances. That is not the case so far and hopefully will not materialize. So we are in for prolonged uncertainty and flexible alliances. And if there is no solution of Ukrainian crisis, then this rivalry will continue on a global scale as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your very interesting presentations. I have a couple of questions, but we have not so many time, so I try to focus on the US and Russian rivalry as maybe one of the reasons of this global uncertainty and Ukraine. So as I understood, all of you, or most of you, agree that this is not a Cold War, but so we are not on the path to a new Cold War because there are huge and crucial differences between the situation then and now. But I think it's widely understood that the relationship between Russia and the US has never been this bad since the Cold War. Many analysts, for instance, Mr. Tsigankov now, have warned of the danger of increasing political rivalry escalating into a military conflict. Firstly, what do you think? And secondly, who is to blame for, or who is more to blame for? Is it too easy to say Mr. Putin is the devil, don't you think? So,
This is a question for me?
It's a question for everyone.
It's a question of responsibility for this crisis, for the state of relationships, right? Well, I think obviously it takes two to spoil the relationships, but it is important also to develop an understanding of which particular part is responsibility of the West and is responsibility of Russia. My view is that certainly Russia has responsibility for this type of crisis that we're in, but it is largely secondary to the responsibility of the United States and NATO specifically. As one Russian observer eloquently put it, Russia broke the United States monopoly for violation of the international law. But it was the United States that first violated international law, and Russia then reciprocated after Kosovo recognition, after Iraq war, and all other developments. Russia went forward with recognizing South Ossetia, Abkhazia, and ultimately going much farther by incorporating Crimea in its territory. So Russia's responsibility here is, of course, there because it also violated the law, and it also frequently inadequately reacted to the United States pressures of the Western powers. That would be my general response to this. And in Ukraine, you have the combination of both. You have the perception on part of Russian authorities that the West has violated all the formal and informal understanding between Russia and Western powers, and we simply had to react to this if we are to preserve our area of responsibility, our sphere of influence, and our interests that are multiple: economic, security, and cultural interests in Ukraine. I'll stop here.
Well, I think it's
Mr.
the
Piotr.
distribution of blame. The attempt of comparing blames and its distribution will not add any positive for our discussion. I would like to tell about one enormous and, to my view, critical misunderstanding between the United States and Russia on issues of post-Soviet space. During yesterday panel, Vladimir Pechatnikov quoted a remark of Russian Ambassador Lukin in Washington in 1992 about cloud of danger. Everything fine, he told, in Russian American relations, and there is a cloud of danger, the events in post-Soviet space. The idea of domination on post-Soviet space or exclusive zone of influence on post-Soviet space was one of the central themes of Russian foreign policy psyche. And it was even formally declared after Georgian war and Medvedev declaration of specific zone of influence. The problems, I think the problems of Russia with post-Soviet space was that these ideas were rejected by our neighbors. Nobody wants to be sphere of influence or special zones of somebody. Nobody needs Moscow as a big brother or teacher of the life. Neither people aspiring on European development like Georgia or Ukraine, nor dictatorship of Nazarbayev, Kirimov, or Lukashenko, because they are perceived himself as a big brothers, and they don't want any godfathers above them in Kremlin. So it was a failed idea of this so-called domination from the very beginning. But Russian elite did not want to face the truth. The problem is that current Russia is not attractive to its neighbors to consider it as a center of gravity. And they decided and convinced themselves, I think Russian politicians, foreign policy, that it's intrigues of America, that it's America, West is intriguing against them. So I think one of the problems, the critical part of responsibility for the event of Soviet post-Soviet is inability of Russian elite to look at itself but eyes of their neighbors who don't want any in this zone of privilege.
Well, I find it very hard to debate responsibility, because then the risk is always that you end up in blaming and shaming the other side. And I guess for instance, in the German discourse, there's good reasons to claim that some policy steps of NATO or the European Union were futile. So maybe the association agreement should have been handled differently. Maybe NATO enlargement wasn't such a smart policy with regard to Ukraine and Georgia. But if you do that, you end up being seen relatively quickly in a camp of, Russlandversteher, so this term which has even entered now the English vocabulary. So I find it very difficult to come to talk about responsibility, and I guess that the core task is is consequence management now. And how do you deal with this situation in the future? And what really concerns me a lot is that, I'm not in permanent touch with Russians and with the Russian, and I don't speak Russian, but what I hear is that we really have two very different discourses, very different narratives in the West or in the EU and NATO on the one hand side, and in Russia on the other hand side. We don't have the same vocabulary anymore, we don't have the same conceptions, so we really talk past each other. And this is very futile and difficult. And my consequence would be that probably the European Union specifically will have to to learn a little bit more the language of geopolitics and Realpolitik again, and understanding that not everything is norms and institutions. So it would have been good if we had understood better what consequences, for instance, the EU agreement had on Russian power elites, on the Russian elites. Maybe we would have been a bit more careful there. And Russia, I guess, also has to understand the rules of norms and institutions better. So one of the things I never understand, or probably Russia and Moscow never understands, is that the enlargement of Western institutions is not something that has only been pushed by Washington. It's something that has been the choice of the countries concerned. And so, yeah, this is one example of really incompatible concepts and vocabulary, and I guess that's the true challenge. But I really liked Andrei's presentation, the last presentation, where he tried to sketch the shape of a future compromise in Ukraine, and I think that's the way we should go forward instead of asking the responsibility question.
Well, I would say I would certainly agree with the point you just made about how the European Union, and also I'd say the United States government, needs to relearn the language of Realpolitik. As soon as you said that, it reminded me of John Kerry saying after the Russian Federation had annexed the Crimean Peninsula, saying that Putin's got to understand that it's not the 19th century anymore, it's the 21st century, and there are these rules and norms, and I mean, Putin, I think, understands what the EU and the United States' perception of the rules of the game are. He just doesn't care. He's playing by his rules, and he'll follow them through. And regardless of whether that angers leaders in other countries. I mean, I actually think that in terms of historical parallels, don't mean to be going back to the 19th century, but Putin, I'd say, has a lot in common with certain czars like Nicholas I and Alexander III, who had this similar idea of we will expand Russia when we can, and we'll create allies when they're necessary, and if they're not, then we don't need them. I mean, Alexander III had a famous statement that Russia needs no friends, it needs only its army and its navy, and that's something that could have come out of the mouth of Putin as well. I think the problem with a lot of American leaders in particular, and this is something that goes back for a while, is they always tend to over-personalize U.S.-American relations as in terms of how their personal relationship is with a Russian leader. Roosevelt, Jimmy Carter, Clinton, Bush, Obama, and then when a Russian leader will do something that they disagree with, they have this sense of personal betrayal, and then they act out, and then they respond accordingly. Because I remember, after the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in '79, Jimmy Carter was ranting in his cabinet. I don't understand. Brezhnev was so friendly with me. He's personally betrayed me by. How could he do something like this after, the times we've met and we were trying to move beyond Cold War tensions? Then he does this, and I think you certainly see that replicated later on too.
So my next question will be sharp, a little bit simplifying as well, but I do so. So who might be loser of this rivalry and competition at the West? Because we are talking about declining the power of the West and the rise of the non-West. This is, of course, a simplifying thing, but what about this loser and so on? Who might be, or is it an adequate question, for example?
Well, I mean, you always have winners and losers in diplomatic conflict. I mean, no one stays on top forever in this type of in global diplomacy. And the United States enjoyed a hegemonic position for a long time, and now it's for a variety of factors, it's not as dominant as it once was. And again, I think in terms of understanding Putin's policies in the last few years is he perceived, rightly or wrongly, the leadership of the West, the American president in particular, Barack Obama, as someone weak or someone who wouldn't resist when he wanted to do certain things, and he acted accordingly. And I would say you would see that there's a similar parallel in the early 1960s when Khrushchev had that same perception of Kennedy and acted accordingly. You detect weakness. If you detect weakness, then you take advantage of it. And again, that's what, again, John Kerry might call a 19th century perception of statecraft, but that's not, in my opinion, just how Putin views relations between different countries. It's how a lot of leaders, some of them seen not as part of the club of the modern, more 21st century world, but that's how they act and will continue to act. So some type, like I said in the essay, some type of conflict, renewed conflict between the United States and Russia was inevitable at some point, given their different interests. But I would say that it's not as if you have this, after 1991, the Cold War ends and American-Russian relations are at a much better point, and then they just gradually decline, getting to where we are now. I'd say it's more of, it's not like falling down a mountain, it's more of like a roller coaster. We've seen decline, improve again. There's, as bad as relations are now, there's been nothing like in 1999, in June of 1999, when NATO soldiers under General Wesley Clark got into a 2-day standoff of Russian peacekeepers at the Pristina International Airport, where they almost started shooting with each other and almost attacked each other. A number of the British NATO generals under Wesley Clark said, yeah, I think we were about 5 minutes away from the Third World War at some point. And there hasn't been anything like that since. And that was, back in 1999. So I think we'll continue to see this, improvements and then declines again, rather than just, they're pretty bad now. There's ways they could get worse, but it's not just one straight path.
Well, I have to confess that I'm not really such a big fan of this decline of the West and rise of the West hypothesis for several reasons. One being that mostly when we have this debate about decline of the West and rise of the West, it mostly focuses on some macroeconomic indicators, GDP, and does ignore a lot of other indicators. I think it's just too early to tell whether or not this is happening, and it's going to be long-term in any case. Also, and here I might disagree a little bit with Andre's last presentation, that, whether or not Russian behavior today is a sign of its strength or a sign of its weakness, it's open to debate. You could put it both ways, I would argue. And also the BRICS, the famous BRICS, if you look at them, they are so heterogeneous. There's not, so there might be the rest rising, but who's the rest if they don't disagree on some major issues? So there's a lot of debate going on there, but in a nutshell, I could also argue, to answer your question straight away, in the end, both could lose. Russia and EU/NATO, because one of the major challenges that we have is the rise of ungovernable spaces. And I guess Iraq and Syria are just the most prominent examples of today, but this is a more general trend. And Ukraine, Eastern Ukraine, can become ungovernable as well. So maybe Russia will find that it doesn't really control that area as much as it would like to. So maybe the answer is both could lose in the end.
Micro, please.
Excuse me.
Push the.
We consider this Ukrainian crisis in terms of rivalries, forgetting about main actor of this crisis, Ukraine itself. For example, the Andrei's compromise plan would be excellent for two big boys, Russia and Moscow and Washington, or maybe for three big boys, Moscow, Washington, and Brussels. But it doesn't take into consideration Ukraine itself. I think in the 21st century, in this current situation in informational sphere, the winner of this conflict will be Ukraine. And out of two competing sides, those whose position Ukraine support and whose position will be favorable for Ukraine itself. You may return to me that there are at least two Ukraine now. This some separatist republics in Donbass. Yes, there are two such territories, but all opinion polls before the conflicts showed that support of separatists are no more than 30% there. And the initial Kremlin plan for Novorossiya, he already failed, because this was planned to create a new group of eight Ukrainian regions. And in 6 out of these 8 regions, the support for this idea of Ruski Mir, Russian world, was minimal. So Kremlin now is a very difficult position how to get out of this situation. Just to retreat would be enormous loss of faith for Putin. To unleash full-scale war would be catastrophic on many economic, political reasons, and would be very unpopular in Russia itself, by the way.
Three points. Let me make 3 points. On decline of the West, the rise of the non-West. Don't get me wrong. I do not mean that we already have a new world. What I am describing is a post-hegemonic transition. The structure of this transition is not yet known to us. It could become fully fledged multipolar world, or it could become, in fact, bipolar world, and Russia is not going to be the second pole. It will be a junior partner in the China coalition. So we don't know the result yet. We only know, and these are objective facts, that the United States is not effectively projecting its power, it is not effectively providing peace and stability, and its security institutions are not working. Second point, just to respond to the previous comments about this sphere of influence that Russia's neighbors do not want. Clearly, these needs of Russia's neighbors must be respected. But they must also be balanced with the needs of Russia for security and with Russia's own security concerns. And these concerns are there. This is geopolitics 101. Come on. There is NATO expansion. There is plenty of resources allocated for missile defense system. The United States has done everything in its power to rebuild its nuclear shield and to extend it globally. There is a subject of global and regional wars in place, and there are objectively security interests that Russia must defend. It must have some presence in the Black Sea, for example. It would hate to see NATO vessels there instead of Black Sea fleet. So these realities are there, and that needs to be taken into consideration whether we like it or not. And the final point on Ukraine, and on Ukraine as a winner, as Andrei just said, I doubt it very much. I doubt very much that Ukraine is a winner. In fact, so far, Ukraine appears to be the biggest loser from this situation, and the developments going forward are not very encouraging for Ukraine. So Ukraine may not necessarily like this package, this compromise package that I have articulated, but great powers must make it attractive for Ukraine. There is a way to convince Ukrainian leaders that it is in its interest to accept this compromise agreement. Ukraine, for example, now is almost a bankrupt economy. The biggest threat is going to be that the economy will implode very soon, within the winter or after winter, and it needs to be addressed. This crisis needs to be addressed urgently. Russia offered initially, as you remember, $15 billion as a package of assistance for President Yanukovych, then it withdrew this money. If this package is still available and is the European Union willing to contribute to this, this will be a very attractive offer. And ultimately, there are different kinds of politicians in Ukraine. Some will be in favor of this small compromise agreement, and that will be beneficial for both Ukraine, Russia, and other players. And ultimately, as I argued, the whole security order will benefit from this, and hopefully the world of great power rivalry might be still averted. Thanks.
A last question from my side, and then we open the discussion. Mr. Warhol said Ukraine and resolving the situation must be a European responsibility, a European task. But I think there is a big possibility for Europe and the European Union to present itself as a united and determined community with a really common foreign policy. I think, for instance, about a possible leading or mediator role in this conflict, but it's still not happening, at least in my view. Why? Why do you think? The question is not happen. So the mediator rule or the leading rule of the European Union is still not there, but it would be a big possibility. I think it's my view. Why? Why is not able? The European Union is not able to do this role?
Okay, I would. Yes, well, I would. It's hard to tell. I mean, the first question, it's two questions that you're bringing up. The one is maybe really the question whether or not, or to what extent, the European Union has been able to play the role of a pacifier or mediator and what so forth. And then discussing as a second question, where are the shortcomings and why are the shortcomings there? I think that the picture is mixed when you look at the European Union and its dealings since the end of last year and in the course of this year. The picture, as I also said in my presentation, is a bit mixed. Diplomatically and economically, I would argue that the European Union has been surprisingly unified. I mean, in non-traditional ways, if you will, but at the beginning of the Ukraine upheaval with the Maidan square and so the situation was fluent at the beginning of this year. I would argue that diplomatically the EU was there with a voice. So we had the three foreign ministers from France and Poland and Germany traveling to Kiev and mediating. And I had the impression that the EU was relatively unified. Interestingly, though, it was unified because of some foreign ministers took the lead. It was not the EU institutions, the External Action Service in the lead. So that is a very typical development. I would say we have the same situation in other we had the same situation in other instances where the EU could speak with one voice. So diplomatically, I think the picture is different. Economic sanctions have already been mentioned. Also, you could see quite a remarkable degree of unity. Obviously, there were hiccups because some countries in the European Union have more trade relations with Russia or more dependent on energy imports than other countries. But given that heterogeneity, it was still quite remarkable how far the EU could act as one. But the big problem is the more traditional, geopolitical rivalry, security policy, and unity within NATO. And I think that is a lack, that is a problem. And the European Union will probably, in many years to come, not be able to deliver the same sense of security as does NATO with the involvement of the United States. And that's a big challenge, I would say. And I would argue that security is the basis for everything else. So I would argue that the picture is relatively mixed. It's not so clear-cut.
I think that April Geneva talk was a success for European Union and demonstration of his unity. If you remember, this was talk of four ministers, German, France, Russia, and Ukraine. And they signed the document together. including the signature of Ukrainian minister, which did not mention even the word Crimea. So, and which contains, by the way, some elements of Andrei's compromise plan about federalization and so on. This is a very, very clear signal to Putin. Yes, you committed this annexation. Maybe it's a special case. We are ready to swallow, but please don't go further. But unfortunately, he went further. And since then, it became more difficult for European Union to create another version of compromise.
Just one point on the European Union. I think in several respects, the European Union leaders, Germany in particular, has already made a tacit acknowledgement of its responsibility for the crisis. Remember that this crisis would have not taken place without Russia and the European Union pulling Ukraine in the opposite directions. We have heard statements not just from Prime Minister Medvedev and the head of Gazprom that Ukraine must ultimately join the Eurasian Union at the expense of its relationships with the European Union, and these two are not compatible. We have heard the similar discourse on the European Union side. Major officials in Germany and Brussels have made these statements that you must choose. There is no other way. In Ukraine, by definition, cannot choose. Historically, culturally, politically, and economically, it's a borderland. It must live in both worlds, and these both worlds must respect it, must find formula for Ukraine to survive and develop as a country, as an economy, while trading with both regional unions. It's not impossible. Technically, this is something that can be done. And Angela Merkel has recently acknowledged that we have objections against Ukraine joining the customs union, but we do not have objections against Ukraine joining the Eurasian Union, which effectively, as many of you know, will be the same thing once the Eurasian Union develops. So now, based on this understanding, this is going to be by far the biggest contribution. Lifting sanctions, political provisions are secondary to this issue. If Ukraine is able to take advantage of both unions and trade with both, then it will be accompanied by economic measures and package of economic assistance. This will be a promising step forward. Thanks.
Yeah, I would just like to add to Marco's point that I completely agree that the EU in itself can't really provide security without the assistance of NATO in this situation, and certainly and that's nothing new. That's the exact same thing we saw over the breakup of Yugoslavia in the 1990s. I would also argue that I would agree that Ukraine's future might not be that bright because, as Andrei was talking about, they had this meeting in Geneva and they didn't want Putin to go any further, and he did go further to supporting this insurgency in eastern Ukraine. And I think Putin's playing a long game here, that if he can possibly annex parts of the eastern part of the country, like he did of Crimea and add them to Russia, great. But if not, if it keeps the government in Kiev tied down with this insurgency and thereby keeping them from forging deeper ties economically, politically with the European Union, then he wins that way as well. And I think, and then again, I think too often, and maybe it's an overused metaphor, but I think too often many leaders of the United States and the EU are playing checkers and Putin is playing chess.
Let me briefly, if I may, respond to Sean. I think the reason why Putin did what he did had to do, a lot of it had to do with the launch of military operation, so-called anti-terrorist operation by Kiev. And Putin thinks in terms of military balance, in terms of preserving the buffer zone between Russia and NATO, and preserving the military security is what he was motivated by. And that actually explains why at this point, Russia is not interested and was not interested to incorporate the so-called Novorossiya following Crimea. Because if it does, then the problem is not solved. If it does, then you have instead a more unified Ukraine that will likely to join NATO, and NATO therefore will still be on your border. Instead, at this point, strongest preference for the Kremlin and for Putin is to have ultimately these regions, Donetsk, Lugansk, within Ukraine proper, to be able to influence Kiev through these regions, for Kiev ultimately to not being able to join NATO is what the game at this point.
All right, now I would like to open the discussion and invite everyone to contribute. We have micros here, and yes, I see 2 hands, please.
Okay, so on? Okay. I have...
Sorry, could you stand up, please?
Yeah.
Could you maybe stand up, please? It's better for...
I'm not sure it's going to make it loud. But, okay, my name's Mark Kramer. I have, first of all, Marco, with respect to the concept of security that you were discussing, it seems to me that concept's been around for a long time. A lot of that existed during the Cold War with respect to, say, Vietnam or Nicaragua or numerous other places, Cuba, etc. It's not to say that concepts don't ever change radically, but it still seems like something that already existed. It's simply been adapted for different circumstances. With regard to what Andrei just mentioned, and then I have one other question to raise about the question of Putin, is the problem for Putin, though, in dealing with the effect that you just mentioned, if Luhansk and Donetsk are kept within Ukraine, he's already removed a very sizable number of pro-Russian voters in Crimea. And it was those voters that gave the ability to Yanukovych to win elections numerous times. Now there is a guaranteed majority against a return of a pro-Russian party ever. And it's a so-called Curley effect, as it's known in political science, and when referring to the old Boston mayor. But so even if Luhansk and Donetsk are kept in, it's still, that basic question will still be there. That's not going to deal with the issue. He created that problem for himself about dividing up Ukraine in such a way that a significant portion of Ukraine will have a much less friendly relationship and potentially hostile relationship with Russia. So it's self-defeating division in many respects. It would have been, in a lot of ways, a lot better with Crimea in Ukraine. And this leads me to the final point, which is, that's where I would still come back. I think that even though I would again argue that the dominant motivation for Putin's action had to do with to crush what he saw as popular unrest against a leader that people wanted to get rid of through extra legal means. And that's exactly what the thrust of his policy has been over the last 10 years or so. And it has led to consequences externally that potentially are very detrimental to Russian leaders. So, by the way, I should add one last thing for Andrei, is you also tend to assume that certain features are durable once they're there, because I happen to agree with what you said about the fecklessness of the United States currently and the things that you said, but almost identical things were said about the United States in the late 1970s under Jimmy Carter. Trends aren't necessarily permanent once they're in place. And So I would just be cautious about that.
Me? Thank you so much, Mark. On Donetsk and Lugansk issue, what you have so far is certainly recognition on part of Donetsk and Lugansk leaders' insistence rather than recognition that they will never be part of Ukraine. But the issue is what Moscow thinks and what Moscow does or what Moscow doesn't as well. Moscow hasn't so far recognized the previous referendums. It did not formally invade this territory, which would have been done easily to formally incorporate those. This is still possible, or was possible, and Putin avoided this. And for now, what you have is essentially a situation of frozen conflict. Not quite frozen because the ceasefire agreement is violated every day, violence continues, but it does subside unless there will be resumption of so-called anti-terrorist operation on part of Kiev. And that's a suboptimal solution from Putin's perspective. His favorite solution initially was stated very clearly, and that was federalization, as you remember. And at that point it was rejected. This confrontation path was chosen, and it wasn't really Putin's choice. So in this case, simply to say that Putin created this situation is not sufficient. You must also look at the other side. Ukrainian side, Kiev is at least as responsible for creating this situation, and Putin's actions have been responsive to this situation. So what you have is largely a frozen conflict, and again, the game plan, as far as the Kremlin is concerned, to keep it this way to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO, as it did prevent Moldova from joining NATO in Transnistria. And it's difficult. At this point, it's very difficult because you also have resistance on part of separatists, on part of Donetsk and Lugansk. They now have their own objectives. It's very difficult to put the genie back in the bottle at this point. So, and with that, I fully agree. And then you mentioned U.S. trends. They certainly do change, I agree. What has changed after the end of the Cold War, and that exacerbated the situation, was the essentially balance of power. One power, one pole declined, and the United States acted on the same ideas, on the same beliefs, in a new geopolitical situation, and that actually eventually got accumulated and exacerbated the problem, because you have essentially a combination of superiority complex on part of the United States and inferiority complex on part of Russia. That psychological dynamics is not healthy at all.
Thank you. I'm Rudolf Turkish. I'm from the United States, and I would like to...
Just a little bit closer. Not just a little bit closer.
What? Can you hear me?
Yes, that's better.
Köszönöm szépen. I would like to thank the learned speakers for their presentations. I learned a lot from it. The follow-up discussion, however, reminded me of a US faculty seminar after the coffee ran out. It was desultory, repetitive, and unhelpful. However, what I would like to focus on is the US component of the East-West relations, or the Cold War issue, which I think is a misnomer to begin with. I would like to focus on President Obama and his legacy problems. His party, of course, was resoundingly defeated in congressional elections. He's facing a Republican-ran Senate and House. He's also facing, in foreign policy terms, a very strong neoconservative push to complete a foreign policy agenda according to their own preferences. Now, to take a step back, President Obama was elected to be commander-in-chief. In the view of many, he ended up being professor-in-chief. Now, the problem with professors is they are intellectuals. Americans do distrust intellectuals, particularly black intellectuals. In other words, President Obama's domestic constituencies with respect to his foreign policy choices have been very limited indeed. For example, just one area, take diplomatic nominations. At this particular point, up to 50 ambassadorial nominations are sitting in Congress, and the Republicans have vetoed it, and they could not be, therefore in 50 different countries in the world, we have charges and we do not have ambassadors. Now, the other issue is involving President Obama's choices with respect to confrontations or indeed staying away from those confrontations. It does seem that he is more or less following a neo-isolationist agenda, try to refocus on US domestic priorities. He is trying to trade his legacy of his service as president. He has two things that he is truly interested in, one being the Obamacare health reform issue, and the second being the immigration law. What the Republicans probably would concede both as against having their way in foreign policy terms. I can visualize Senator McCain running to Kiev tomorrow morning practically and promising everything under the sun to bail out those wonderful people. The other issue is the ongoing skepticism in the United States involving the military community, involving NATO. NATO countries, there are two kinds. Those that honor their 2% GDP commitment to defense budget, and those who don't. Now, the other issue, more particularly Germany. It's all very interesting. Germany's heavy involvement, trade and business with Russia, but there are also voices talking about a new Rapallo, a special German-Russian relationship over everybody's heads and trading this particular relationship for everything else. The US is also at war, a very silent war, with the European Union, involving trade issues, involving various interests of major US corporations and similar things. And finally, of course, the cyber war issue that will come up this afternoon. And let's not kid ourselves, the US has been listening to everybody. Not only its own citizens against the Constitution, but everybody else out there. So there are no doubts as far as the US military, the intelligence community are concerned with respect to foreign intentions. Putin surely is an important figure in that, but not all. So we are up against an open-ended agenda, full of uncertainties, and something that ought to be factored in when we discuss these issues.
Thank you very much. But we have very limited time, please.
Well, I would say that a couple of things. One, in terms of Obama's foreign policy over the next 2 years, it's a lot like certain things he's going to avoid doing in domestic policy. To use a basketball analogy, since that's his favorite sport, he's going to try and run out the clock and hope that nothing blows up on his watch. If he does want to get some legacy deal of foreign policy, it'll probably be trying to get a nuclear deal with Iran. I would say that, we have this bombing war in Syria against ISIS, which isn't going very well. His relations with the Pentagon are terrible. There's been a lot of leaks to the American press by a number of senior generals who are very opposed to his strategy there. And so I would say there's certainly not going to be, I would doubt there would be an attempt by Washington right now to increase to any great degree tension with Russia beyond what already exists. But I will say this, whoever is the new president after 2016, whether it's Hillary Clinton or anyone from the Republican side, Chris Christie, Scott Walker, whoever, it's going to be a more hawkish foreign policy after that. I mean, Clinton, a number of people close to her, like Leon Panetta in his new memoir, have been very critical of what Obama has done in terms of his foreign policy, including his dealings with Putin. You know, which is kind of surprising given the fact that the reset was something Hillary Clinton was pushing for even more than Obama originally. But maybe it's that sense of betrayal that frequently reoccurs with American leaders and their dealings with Russia that we see. So.
Well, I still would like to reply to what Dr. Kramer said about concepts of security. I mean, of course, I acknowledge that, and that's also what I said, that these two different concepts, which for reasons of simplicity I put forward, they were with us during the Cold War and they are with us after the Cold War and in this new situation. But I think that the crucial point I would like to make is that we have a hard time, at least in the EU, I would say, to rethink our concepts of security and ask ourselves whether we approach the Ukraine crisis, for instance, with the right conception, with the right concept of security. And my point being that at least in the security and military domain, we still had a very traditional understanding of security, whereas the security challenges and threats are non-traditional and are not about territory and borders and more about control of resources, information and populations. And this is nothing new, but we need to rethink it under the new circumstances. That's the point I wanted to make. Maybe a last remark on the last gentleman's intervention on German-Russian relations. I think that German-Russian relations have been characterized, have been portrayed in a little bit more simplistic terms recently. For instance, there has been the debate that the German population has a certain equidistance between the United States and Russia, so looking to both ways. And I can definitely say this is not the case, that the Western anchorage or the Western roots of Germany are not challenged at all. Of course, in the economic sphere, there have been some ties and important ties with Russia. But I would say that recently in the Ukraine crisis, and especially the downing of the Malaysian aircraft, has really changed the German discourse a lot. So Germany initially was very reluctant with regard to tough economic sectoral sanctions. Because of it would mean economic harm to a lot of German companies, and it's easier for the United States to come up with sanctions because the trade volume is not just as important. But then after the Malaysian aircraft crashed or was shut down, discourse changed a lot, and I think there is I don't know if this is going to be a long-term change in German policy towards Russia, but there was at least a change towards the Ukraine crisis.
If I can add one thing real quick, I mean, if there's another Western leader who really personally dislikes Putin besides Barack Obama, it's certainly Angela Merkel. So I would say that as long as she is Chancellor of Germany, there's really no danger of a new Rapallo.
Well, I think it's too early to make a judgment on President Obama foreign policy. Unfortunately, I'm afraid that the next 2 years will be very dramatic, and President Barack Obama will have opportunity to demonstrate his skills. The only thing what I like to note as a nuclear strategy expert is that his idea of so-called nuclear zero was very unsuccessful and empty from the very beginning, and I hope that he already realized it himself. But the only point, foreign policy point, on which I fully agree with Vladimir Putin and any other Russian expert, is that Russia will never abandon nuclear weapon, at least on the reasons that we have on our eastern border, the neighbor which conventional army are much more powerful than ours.
I would agree with Sean on Rapallo, and not just for lack of personal chemistry or good relationships between Putin and Merkel, but also because Germany has distinctly distinct economic and security interests, and they do not always coincide with interests of Russia. Germany increasingly takes a stronger role on the continent, and if the United States is not likely to rebalance, as Marco put it, then Germany is likely to place more responsibility on itself, and that too will create further tensions. On Obama's legacy problem, I think he definitely mismanaged relationships with Russia. He has a very lousy record from this perspective. He became essentially hostage to domestic politics. He has not shown leadership on the issue of relationships with Russia, and domestic politics is effectively anti-Russian. He initially tried, for instance, to block the so-called Magnitsky Law, but ultimately failed because of the opposition from Congress, and he chose not to quarrel with Congress because of this. But Obama, of course, deserves credit for certain things. At least he tried to manage relationships over Ukrainian crisis. He did not arm Ukraine, and that's a positive contribution. He did not escalate earlier in the Middle East until recently. So it's a contradictory legacy, but overall, still, probably the verdict is negative. In the future, it's very hard to tell who is going to be president, but I would not be as pessimistic because I expect that the United States will try to reach out to Russia, the new leader, whoever it is. Even Hillary Clinton, with her harsh rhetoric, is going to need some cooperation from Russia. It's not going to be the reset, but it will be a new invitation, new opening. And again, don't forget that we are increasingly living in the post-hegemonic, post-Western world. There will be other crises outside Russia. There will be further crises in South China Sea that will demand United States attention. There will be further crises in the Middle East. And in both Asia and Middle East, Russia continues to be important, so there will be need for cooperation. Thank you.
I don't see other hands. So, would you like to ask one last question? There's an opportunity. Or we have a short question, please, and then we make a short answer round, and then it's finished. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Daniel Isles, and I work at the Antall József Knowledge Center. I just wanted to say that I recently attended a NATO conference in Bratislava, Slovakia, with some of my colleagues, which was focusing on the future military cooperation of the V4 countries in NATO, and the fact that the US's involvement, both militarily and financially, are slowly decreasing. And some of the speakers pointed out that the EU makes a big mistake if it takes the US's role for granted. Since some of the points made during this conference in Bratislava could have been based on Mr. Overhouse's final points, I'd like to ask him. He kind of answered this question just now. What do you think about the US's gradual withdrawal from NATO? And by that, I really mean the decreasing its decreasing role. Could Germany, as the biggest EU economy, take over that role and confront Russia if necessary, especially at times of high tensions? If you could expand on that, thank you.
Well, I don't think that the United States will withdraw from NATO or will challenge its membership in that organization. But what I have seen or witnessed in the past months or since the beginning of the Ukraine crisis is a growing gap between expectations in parts of Europe and the willingness and ability of the US to deliver, and also, of course, of the European Union to fill that gap. I mean, as I said, we focus now again very much on Article 5 and territorial and collective defense, and about deploying forces from Western Europe to Eastern Europe, and increasing exercises and creating a rapid reaction force that didn't work in the past. And so there's this expectation that, you know, I guess the United States will re-engage more because it's seen specifically in Poland and the Baltic republics as the only credible security actor. And I think that that is the problem of this, you know, rising gap between expectations and delivery. And then against this backdrop, it's of concern to me that other European countries, notably Germany, are to the current extent not willing or able to fill that gap. We had this, I mean, for me this is really the first time since the end of the Cold War, the first time in the past 25 years that the credibility of Article 5 is really challenged seriously. And that doesn't mean that we ought to go to war again, it's just the question of, is it credible? I mean, would we, if for some reason we would have to rely on Article 5 of the NATO treaty, would this be credible? And I think this is on the line. And there have been reports earlier this year about leaked reports from NATO, as I said, challenging whether or not NATO would be able to respond to any serious attack. And there have been similar reports about readiness of the German armed forces. I found it very interesting. We had the Polish defense minister visiting Berlin 2 weeks ago, or a couple of days ago, and he made a very strong point arguing that he wants strong German armed forces and sees this as very crucial, and this is a very interesting statement given the history of Polish-German relations by a Polish defense minister. So I see the challenge of this credibility deliverance gap, and I don't see that European countries are able or willing to fulfill or fill that gap for the moment. So this is really a challenge for the future.
There is no smallest inclination in Germany, as in Germany and Europe as a whole, to war with Russia. And I tell you one piece of evidence. This unfortunate Putin doctrines of Ruski Mir and his claim to protect ethnic Russian everywhere certainly aroused apprehension at least in two countries members of NATO, Latvia and Estonia, which have Russian ethnic minority. And there was a poll, opinion poll in Germany somewhere in April, as I remember. I read it in the article of Edward Lucas in Economist. And the question was very direct. In the case of Russian intervention, aggression, or want, in Estonia, should Germany fulfill its obligation according to Article 5 of NATO treaty? The answer, no, we should stay neutral, was got 70% of vote. It's a very hypothetical case, but it's demonstrate very clearly the level of so-called aggressiveness of NATO toward Russia. I think that this subject of NATO expansion is used, overused for 15 or 20 years ago already by Russian propaganda to justify anti-Western posture of Russian policy, driven by different reasons and considerations.
I would also say that I agree that given the fact that the United States promised, Barack Obama was interested in, of course, this pivot to Asia, with the idea that American commitments to Europe and NATO was a relic of the Cold War. But we've never really pivoted yet. And it's because of the fact that most of the European countries aren't willing to step up and replace America's role in NATO and providing European security means you're going to still maintain this status quo. And again, I would argue in 2016, you'll probably see more renewed, after 2016, we'll see a more renewed American commitment to Europe. But based on what Andre said, I just want to clarify that just because our President, Barack Obama, is hoping not to have a crisis explode in his last 2 years doesn't mean there won't be one. I mean, unfortunately, American foreign policy right now in so many areas, the Middle East, Russia, Europe, is an incoherent mess. Like in Syria right now, we're bombing the people who are fighting the guy we were this close to going to war with last year. And so, unfortunately, that is likely to continue, I would say, for the next 2 years, despite his attempts to find a foreign policy legacy, and it's probably going to be a dangerous and unpredictable time.
A last comment?
One final point to respond to Andrei's remarks on NATO and Putin's Ruski Mir nationalism. On NATO, the standard position that most countries, and Russia is no exception here, is that security is important. Intentions is one thing, capabilities is another, and capabilities is what matters ultimately. As Grigory Yavlinsky said once, you can decorate a tank with flowers, you can paint it in pink, it will still be tank. And if you move it forward to Russian borders, then the Russians are going to react. So that's something that will be there. Whether it's a subject of domestic politics is secondary. It is, but it is secondary. And on the Ruski Mir nationalism, Putin certainly has taken advantage of the situation, no questions about it. And again, if you read his Crimea speech, it certainly is a speech, it reads like a speech of Russian nationalists, more than 22 references to Ruski rather than Rossiyski, ethnic Russian. But again, I would not carry this line very far. Putin remains statist rather than nationalist. He uses Russian nationalism. He uses some of these folks, but they are not really able to drive his agenda. In this respect, he is more akin to the Russian traditional statesmanship, like Russian czars. He's using nationalism. You might recall, for instance, how Nicholas I handled Slavophiles, who wanted him to ultimately topple Constantinople to provide all kinds of military assistance for Balkans revolutionaries. He was sympathetic with the ideas, but he didn't either support them all the way, and of course he did not go to Constantinople. So Putin simply wants to have the statesman flexibility. He wants to appeal to these constituencies, in part because he wants to deflect these nationalist pressures inside Russia. This is a popular agenda, and he wants to be a part of it as a politician. That's simple as that.
So thank you very much for this very inspiring and spirited discussion, and I think in the lunch time there will be some possibility to talk to the panelists personally too. So let's have a lunch break. Bon appetit, jó étvágyat mindenkinek, and we'll see you again.